Marcus Sullivan had barely finished his morning coffee when the doorbell rang with the aggressive persistence of someone who believed they held all the cards. Through the frosted glass, he could make out the familiar silhouettes of three people standing on his porch like a tribunal of suburban justice. He already knew what this was about. "Mr. Sullivan," announced Patricia Whitmore, the HOA president, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone who had never been told no in a homeowners association meeting. She stood flanked by two other board members, clipboards in hand and expressions that could curdle milk. "We need to discuss your maritime situation." Marcus opened the door wider, genuinely curious about how this conversation would unfold. At 62, he had seen enough corporate boardroom battles to recognize when someone was about to overplay their hand spectacularly. "Maritime situation," he repeated, unable to suppress a slight smile. Patricia's lips pursed tighter. Behind her, board member Gerald Hopkins shifted nervously, while Treasurer Linda Chen clutched her clipboard like a shield. "Your boat," Patricia continued, gesturing dramatically toward the pristine lake that stretched behind Marcus' property. "That monstrosity has been anchored in our community waters for 3 weeks now. It's an eyesore, it's disrupting our fishing club's activities, and frankly, it's bringing down property values." Marcus followed her gaze to where his 36-foot cabin cruiser, Second Chance, sat peacefully at anchor about 200 yards from shore. The boat was immaculate, white hull gleaming in the morning sun, brass fittings polished to perfection. If anything, it added elegance to the lake's natural beauty. "According to Section 4.7 of our community guidelines," Linda piped up, reading from her clipboard with the fervor of someone citing biblical scripture, "no watercraft may be moored in Lake Serenity for more than 72 hours without express written permission from the Homeowners Association." "Lake Serenity?" Marcus asked, genuinely puzzled. "Is that what you're calling it now?" Patricia's chest puffed with pride. "We voted on the name last month. It's much more appealing than Miller's Pond, don't you think? More sophisticated. Better for marketing when people are considering purchasing homes in Willowbrook Estates." Marcus nodded slowly, his mind racing back 30 years to a very different conversation about the same body of water. "I see. And the fishing club." "The Willowbrook Anglers Society," Gerald finally spoke up, finding his voice. "We have exclusive recreational rights to the lake. Your boat is anchored right in our prime bass fishing spot. Our members are paying good money for access, and they can't exactly cast their lines with that thing sitting there." "Exclusive rights," Marcus repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting. And who granted these exclusive rights?" Patricia waved dismissively. "The previous property owner, of course. Old Mr. Miller was very accommodating before he passed. Understood the value of community cooperation. We have a verbal agreement." "A verbal agreement." Marcus's smile was growing wider by the minute, though none of the three HOA representatives seemed to notice the warning signs. "Look, Mr. Sullivan," Patricia continued, her tone becoming more condescending, "I understand you're new to the community. You bought the old Miller place, 6 months ago? You're probably not familiar with how things work around here. But we have rules, and those rules exist to maintain the character and value of our neighborhood." Marcus leaned against his doorframe, thoroughly enjoying the performance. "And if I don't move my boat?" Patricia's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone about to deliver a crushing blow. "Then we'll be forced to take legal action. The HOA has significant resources at our disposal, Mr. Sullivan. We've successfully sued 3 homeowners in the past 5 years for various violations. Our attorney specializes in property law." "We're trying to be neighborly about this," Linda added, though her tone suggested anything but neighborliness. "But that boat needs to be gone by Friday, or we file papers Monday morning." The three stood there expectantly, clearly waiting for Marcus to either capitulate or begin pleading for mercy. What they didn't expect was for him to chuckle softly and shake his head. "Well," Marcus said finally, "this is certainly going to be interesting." By Thursday afternoon, Patricia Whitmore felt the familiar rush of vindication coursing through her veins. She sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Henderson, Burke and Associates, watching their property attorney, James Henderson, flip through a stack of documents with the methodical precision of a man who had never lost a case against a stubborn homeowner. "This should be straightforward," Henderson assured her, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "We have the community guidelines clearly stating the 72-hour rule, we have documented complaints from multiple residents, and we have your fishing club's established usage rights. Mr. Sullivan doesn't have a legal leg to stand on." Patricia nodded smugly. Behind her, Gerald Hopkins fidgeted with his phone, scrolling through angry messages from fishing club members who had been forced to find alternative spots for their weekend tournaments. The Spring Bass Challenge was only 2 weeks away, and Second Chance was still sitting exactly where Marcus had anchored it, completely unmoved by their ultimatum. "I've drafted the initial complaint," Henderson continued, sliding a document across his desk. "We're seeking immediate injunctive relief to force removal of the vessel, plus damages for disruption of community amenities. I estimate we'll have him in court within 10 days. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus sat in a considerably less impressive office, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the smell of old paper. His friend and attorney, Robert Chen, no relation to the HOA's treasurer, looked nothing like the polished legal shark that Patricia had hired. Bob's office was cluttered, his tie was crooked, and he had the appearance of someone who had spent more time in research libraries than courtrooms. "You know, Marcus," Bob said, looking up from a leather-bound ledger that appeared to be older than both of them. "When you called me about this HOA situation, I thought it would be a simple boundary dispute. But this," he gestured to the mountain of documents spread across his desk, "this is something else entirely." Marcus leaned back in his chair, sipping coffee from a mug that read, "World's Okayest Lawyer," a gift from Bob's daughter. "What did you find?" Bob pulled out a surveyor's map, its edges yellowed with age. "Do you remember when you bought the Miller property and the realtor mentioned that the sale included water rights and associated recreational privileges? I don't think you realized what that actually meant. I figured it meant I could fish from my dock without asking permission." "Marcus," Bob said, his voice taking on the tone of someone about to deliver life-changing news, "according to these deeds dating back to 1923, your property doesn't just include water rights. You own the entire lake." The coffee mug paused halfway to Marcus's lips. "Come again?" Bob spread out several documents, pointing to various sections highlighted in yellow. The original property was 847 acres, including what was then called Miller's Lake. When the land was subdivided in the 1970s to create Willowbrook Estates, the lake itself was never separated from the Miller parcel. The developers apparently assumed the Homeowners Association would eventually purchase the water rights, but that transaction never happened. Marcus set down his mug carefully, so when the HOA claims they have exclusive fishing rights, they have nothing. Bob finished. No legal standing whatsoever. In fact, technically speaking, their fishing club has been trespassing for the past 15 years. The two men sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications. Outside Bob's window, the afternoon traffic hummed past, completely unaware that the balance of power in Willowbrook Estates was about to shift dramatically. "There's more," Bob continued, pulling out another document. "The lake includes a 50-foot buffer zone around the entire perimeter. That means the HOA's little fishing pier, it's on your property. The boat launch they installed last year, also yours." The lake Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Patricia Whitmore feel invincible. She had already fielded 3 calls from fishing club members expressing their gratitude that the HOA was finally taking action against that boat guy. The Spring Bass Challenge was still on schedule. Henderson had assured her the legal papers were ready to file, and by week's end, Lake Serenity would be back to its pristine, boat-free condition. What Patricia didn't know was that James Henderson had arrived at his office 2 hours early, specifically to run a comprehensive title search before filing the lawsuit. It was standard practice, due diligence that had saved him from embarrassment more than once in his 20-year career. Henderson was nothing if not thorough. He was halfway through his second cup of coffee when his paralegal Sandra knocked on his door with an expression that immediately put him on alert. "Mr. Henderson, I think you need to see this." Sandra placed a stack of documents on his desk, her usually steady hands trembling slightly. "I was running the property records for the Sullivan case, cross-referencing the lake boundaries with the HOA's claimed territory," and she paused, looking like someone who had just discovered a body. "Sir, we have a problem. A big problem." Henderson set down his coffee and began reading. The color drained from his face with each page he turned. By the time he reached the original 1923 deed, his hands were shaking worse than Sandra's. "This can't be right," he muttered, reaching for his phone to call the county clerk's office. "There has to be some mistake." 20 minutes and the Willowbrook Estates Community Center had never seen a turnout like this. By 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening, every folding chair was occupied, with residents lining the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Marcus Sullivan had called an emergency community meeting to discuss important matters regarding Lake Serenity and community recreational facilities. Patricia Whitmore sat in the front row, her usual commanding presence reduced to a nervous fidgeting with her purse strap. Gerald and Linda flanked her like bodyguards at a trial, all three stealing glances at Marcus, who sat calmly at a table near the front of the room, a manila folder placed neatly before him. The crowd buzzed with speculation. Most residents assumed Marcus was finally ready to apologize and move his boat. The fishing club members were already planning their weekend tournament. Property owners who had complained about the eyesore anchored in their pristine lake were ready to claim victory. Marcus stood up, and the room gradually fell silent. At 62, he had the presence of someone accustomed to boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations, but his demeanor was more professorial than confrontational. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying easily through the packed room. "I know many of you are curious about my boat and about the recent misunderstanding with the HOA board. I thought it would be best to address everyone at once so there's no confusion about the situation." From the back of the room, fishing club member Tom Rodriguez called out, "So when are you moving that thing? We've got the Spring Bass Challenge in 10 days. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Marcus smiled, the same enigmatic smile that had unsettled Patricia a week earlier. "That's exactly what I want to talk about," Marcus replied. "But first, I think everyone should understand the actual legal situation regarding the lake." He opened his manila folder and pulled out a document. "How many of you have lived in Willowbrook Estates for more than 10 years? About half the hands in the room went up. Then you probably remember when this was called Miller's Lake, named after the family that owned the property for nearly a century. Marcus held up an aged surveyor's map large enough for the front rows to see. What you might not know is that when this community was developed in the 1970s, the lake itself was never actually transferred to the Homeowners Association. Patricia felt her stomach drop. Around the room, confused murmurs began to rise. Marcus continued, his tone remaining conversational. "According to county records dating back to 1923, the lake, its bed, all water rights, and a 50-foot buffer zone around the entire perimeter belong to whoever owns the original Miller property." He paused, letting the implications settle. "I bought that property 6 months ago." The room erupted. Voices rose in disbelief, anger, and confusion. Fishing Club President Dave Matthews stood up, his face red with indignation. "That's impossible. We've had exclusive fishing rights for 15 years. We pay annual fees. We have agreements." "With whom?" Marcus asked gently. Dave pointed at Patricia. "With the HOA. They've been managing lake access since the community was built." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And did the HOA ever show you a deed, a lease agreement, any legal document proving they had the right to grant access to the lake?" The room fell silent as the reality began to sink in. Residents looked at each other, then at the HOA board, then back at Marcus. Patricia's face had gone completely white. Linda Chen found her voice first, standing on shaky legs. "Mr. Sullivan, surely we can work something out. The community has invested thousands of dollars in improvements. The pier, the boat launch. The pier and boat launch that were built on my property without my permission." Marcus interrupted, though his tone remained mild. "Yes, we definitely need to discuss those." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Residents were shouting questions, fishing club members were demanding refunds, and property owners who had paid premium prices for lake access homes were calculating their losses. Through it all, Marcus stood calmly at the front of the room, waiting for the storm to pass. Finally, elderly resident Martha Henderson, no relation to the lawyer, raised her voice above the din. "Mr. Sullivan, what exactly do you want from us?" The room quieted, everyone straining to hear his answer. This was the moment that would determine whether they were dealing with a reasonable neighbor or a vindictive property owner with legal grounds for revenge. Marcus surveyed the crowd, making eye contact with residents throughout the room. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for everyone to understand that I didn't create this situation. When the HOA board came to my door last week, they didn't ask politely about my boat. They didn't inquire about working out an arrangement. They threatened me with lawsuits and demanded I remove my property from my own lake." He gestured toward Patricia and her colleagues. They claimed exclusive rights they never possessed to property they never owned while collecting fees from community members for access they had no legal authority to grant. Tom Rodriguez stood up again, his voice desperate. "So what happens now? Do you lose fishing privileges? What about the tournament?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of his neighbors. These weren't the people who had threatened him. They were community members who had been missold by their elected representatives. "Here's what's going to happen," he said finally. "Effective immediately, the Willowbrook Anglers Society is dissolved. All fees collected over the past 15 years will need to be refunded to members, since they were collected under false pretenses." The room erupted again, but Marcus raised his hand for silence. "However," he continued, and the word hung in the air like a lifeline, "I'm not unreasonable. I understand that many of you bought homes here specifically because of lake access. I understand that fishing is important to this community." He paused, letting hope creep back into the room. "So here's what I'm prepared to offer. I will grant the community reasonable recreational access to the lake under a proper legal agreement with appropriate insurance and liability protections. There will be rules, my rules, and there will be fees to cover maintenance and insurance, but it will be legitimate, legal, and fair." Patricia finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "And if we don't agree to your terms?" Marcus's smile returned, and this time it wasn't enigmatic. It was absolutely crystal clear. Then tomorrow morning, I'll be installing no trespassing signs around the entire perimeter of my property, and anyone found on the lake without permission will be prosecuted for trespassing. The pier and boat launch will be removed at the HOA's expense, and the land will be restored to its original condition. The room fell silent as a tomb. Marcus gathered his papers and prepared to leave. You have 1 week to decide. The choice is yours. Friday afternoon found Marcus sitting on the deck of Second Chance, enjoying the peaceful solitude of his lake. It had been exactly 1 week since the community meeting, and the deadline he had set was now just hours away. His phone had been ringing constantly. Residents calling to ask questions, HOA board members begging for extensions, and even a few reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the story. But it was the knock on his front door at precisely 5 o'clock that he had been expecting. Patricia Whitmore stood on his porch, but she was barely recognizable as the imperious HOA president who had confronted him 2 weeks earlier. Her usual armor of authority had been replaced by the deflated posture of someone who had learned humility the hard way. Behind her stood the entire HOA board, along with several other residents Marcus recognized from the community meeting. "Mr. Sullivan," Patricia began, her voice lacking any trace of its former commanding tone, "we'd like to accept your offer." Marcus invited them in, gesturing toward his living room where he had already prepared a pot of coffee and arranged chairs in a circle. The formal documents sat on his coffee table, prepared by Bob Chen and reviewed by 3 different attorneys to ensure everything was legally bulletproof. "Before we sign anything," Patricia continued, settling into her chair with visible discomfort, "I owe you an apology. We were wrong to threaten you. We were wrong to assume we had rights we didn't possess, and we were wrong to treat you like an outsider instead of a neighbor." Gerald Hopkins nodded emphatically. "The fishing club members have asked me to formally apologize as well. We were so focused on protecting what we thought were our rights that we never stopped to question whether those rights actually existed." Marcus poured coffee for everyone, taking his time to respond. "I appreciate that, and I want you to know that I didn't reveal the property ownership to embarrass anyone. I simply wanted people to understand the real situation before we move forward." Linda Chen pulled out a folder stuffed with papers. "We've prepared the financial disclosure you requested. Every fee collected by the fishing club over the past 15 years, every expense for lake improvements, all of it documented." She paused, looking genuinely remorseful. "We're prepared to make full restitution for any fees collected under false pretenses." "That won't be necessary," Marcus replied, surprising everyone in the room. "What's done is done. The people who paid those fees received value. They did get to fish. They did get to use the facilities. The problem wasn't with the members. It was with the lack of proper legal framework." He pulled out the contracts he had prepared. "Here's what I'm proposing. The community will have access to the lake for recreational fishing, non-motorized boating, and swimming. There will be reasonable rules about noise, litter, and safety. The existing pier and boat launch can remain, but they'll be properly insured and maintained." Tom Rodriguez, who had been invited as the former fishing club president, leaned forward eagerly. "What about tournaments? The Spring Bass Challenge?" Marcus smiled. "The tournament can proceed as scheduled. In fact, I'd like to donate the prize money this year. Consider it a gesture of goodwill toward the community." The room buzzed with surprised murmurs. This was far more generous than anyone had dared to hope. "There will be an annual community access fee," Marcus continued, "but it will be modest and transparent. The money will go into a dedicated account for lake maintenance, insurance, and improvements. The HOA will manage day-to-day operations, but under a formal agreement that clearly defines everyone's rights and responsibilities." Patricia looked up from the contract she was reading, confusion evident on her face. "Mr. Sullivan, this is incredibly generous. After how we treated you, why?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, gazing out his window at the lake where his boat sat peacefully at anchor. 25 years ago, I lived in a community not unlike this one. I was on the HOA board there, and I'm ashamed to say I probably would have handled this situation exactly the way you did. I was so focused on property values and community standards that I forgot we were all just neighbors trying to enjoy our homes." He turned back to the group. "I bought this property because I wanted peace and quiet in my retirement. But I also bought it because I remembered fishing on this lake as a kid when old Mr. Miller would let neighborhood children cast their lines from his dock. Community isn't about exclusion and rules. It's about finding ways for people to coexist and enjoy the good things in life." Gerald wiped his eyes, clearly moved. "So the fishing club can continue? Under new management and with proper legal standing, yes. In fact, I'd like to suggest that we expand it. Instead of the Willowbrook Anglers Society, what about the Lake Miller Community Fishing Club? Honor the original name, welcome members from neighboring communities, maybe start a youth program to teach local kids how to fish responsibly." The contracts were signed within an hour. As the group prepared to leave, Patricia lingered behind. "Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly, I've been HOA president for 8 years. I thought I was protecting the community, but I realize now that I was just protecting my own idea of what the community should be. Would you consider joining the board? We could use someone with your perspective." Marcus chuckled, the same worn laugh that had echoed through Bob Chen's office 2 weeks earlier. "I think I'll stick to being a regular member, but I'm happy to help out with the lake committee, make sure everything runs smoothly." As the sun set over Lake Miller, Patricia had quietly agreed to change the name back. Marcus returned to his boat. The Spring Bass Challenge was scheduled for the following weekend, and he was looking forward to participating. He had even invited his grandson to come up from Indianapolis for the tournament. From his deck chair, he could see families walking along the newly designated public shoreline, children skipping stones while their parents set up picnic tables. The Hendersons were teaching their teenage daughter how to cast a fishing line, and the Rodriguezes were launching their kayak from the boat ramp. It looked exactly like a community should look. His phone buzzed with a text from Bob Chen. "Saw the local paper's coverage of your HOA situation. Local man turns property dispute into community victory. Nice work. Dinner Sunday to celebrate." Marcus typed back, "Only if you bring your fishing rod. I have a feeling this lake is going to be very popular." As he hit send, Marcus reflected on how quickly things could change. 2 weeks ago, he had been a newcomer being threatened with lawsuits. Tonight, he was a community member who had turned a potential disaster into an opportunity for neighbors to actually become neighborly. Sometimes, he thought as he watched the last of the sunset reflect off the calm water, the best way to win a fight is to make sure everyone wins. His boat rocked gently at anchor, no longer a symbol of conflict, but simply a beautiful vessel on a lake where everyone was welcome.